Thank you everybody for coming out this evening. Welcome to Monash for another Feith seminar. I think it's only our second this year so far, but we have an exciting speaker in August and we'll send you some information about that really soon. But this evening it's my great pleasure to welcome a very special guest all the way from Canada, Professor Abidin Kusno. I'd like to first thank Kate McGregor and Amanda Ahmadi from the Indonesia Forum at Melbourne University for sharing Abidin with us and allowing him to extend his visit to Melbourne Uni so that he could be here this evening. Some of you who are familiar perhaps with the scholarship on post-New Order Indonesia in particular, new ideas in history, in urbanism, culture and architecture, would most definitely have come across Abidin's work. Abidin is Professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Asian Urbanism and Culture and also serves as co-director of the Centre of Southeast Asian Research. His research interests include global cities, urban, suburbanism, politics and culture, history and theory of architecture, urban design and planning, nationalism, colonial and post-colonialism, and Asian studies. So pretty much everything. Kusno is an author of books in Indonesian and English, and two of his most recent titles include After the New Order, Space, Politics and Jakarta, and the other, The Appearances of Memory, Mnemonic Practices of Architecture and Urban Form in Indonesia. And this evening, he'll be telling us about his forthcoming book, Visual Cultures of the Ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. Please join with me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Kate, for giving me this opportunity to come over here to share with you some aspects of my work. In fact, this is a sort of a work that is not really immediately related to a sort of things that I have been doing in the past 15, 20 years, which is about history of architecture and urbanism. Today, what I'm going to share with you is a sort of a work that is closer to what we might call issues around ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. So I wouldn't claim myself to be an expert in the field of ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. I merely probably share the kind of a social order, right, of Indonesia in the ways that allow me to think about this subject matter. So in some ways, I should say it's still connected to my field because it is still about the built environment. Yeah, but I'm really somehow trying to frame the issues in a way that would allow me to understand the constructions of ethnic Chinese identity, yeah, through architecture and the built environment. So I think that is sort of the basic interest that I have in mind, yeah, trying to locate ethnic Chinese in Suharto's, in post-Suharto's social order by way of looking at particular house type, which we call shop house. Yeah. In Indonesia, there's a term for that, which is called rumah toko, yeah, a combination of house and shop. Which is an interesting built form, partly because it has always been associated with ethnic Chinese. And I first maybe should mention that my talk is going to be structured in two ways. So the first one will be really about shop houses. And I will share with you how I approach these issues, the kind of materials I have gathered, and what could be the issues that we can discuss together. And then the second part is really about the book that Gemma was mentioning. Yeah, it's a forthcoming book It is still in the form of a manuscript. It is really a book about visual cultures of ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. It's about different genres, from architecture to family album, to film, to popular culture, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so there are two parts in my talk. One is about the subject matter called shop houses, and the second part is basically introducing the book in itself through an explanation of the table of contents. Okay, so again, whenever I try to start thinking about issues of ethnic Chinese, quite often, you just look at the built environment, and then you start to pick up some of the ways in which people talk about, say, ethnic Chinese, the ruko, and so on and so forth. So the first thing I remember when I got interested in looking at the shop house, it has to do with, say, I have to use the mouse, sorry. Right, this is a quotation that I pick up when I wrote a piece about May riots in 1998. And you look at all these newspapers report, and one of the most striking one is a commentary of the governor of Jakarta at that time, Sutioso, who basically reported to the media about the extent of the damages that has been done to the city. So you can read it, here there are 13 markets and over 2,400 shop houses, malls, shops, all these different categories: police stations, offices, restaurants, hotels, gas stations, cars, and so on and so forth, including houses and a church. So what struck me at that time is this whole notions of ruko, shop houses, over 2,400 shop houses. And so that really made me wonder about, whether there's a kind of a relations, right, between say the perceptions of ethnic Chinese and a building type called shop house. So it's almost in a way one could think about the shop house as the embodiment of Chinese identity. So you go around the city, maybe the easiest way to think about who is the owner is to just have this association about shop house, about ruko and ethnic Chinese, and that normally becomes a sort of a target during the unrest, during the riot. So this is just one instance that made me realize that maybe there's something I could talk about, ruko. And the whole idea is to really try to look at how ethnic Chinese identity is produced, not only by media, but also by the Indonesian population, as well as by ethnic Chinese themselves, by way of thinking about the ruko, the shop house. And so I start to look at different ways in which people talk about shop houses. Now, this is a quotation from historian Rudolf Mrajek. Some of you probably have read his work. He has a wonderful book called Engineers of Happy Land: Technology and Nationalism in a Colony. And he has come up with this little sort of a footnote. In fact, this is not even in his main text. It's just in a footnote, I quote, like, the living quarters, right? This is actually referring to the shop house, with a build-up, right, imagine safety off the ground as a response to the ever unpredictable and as often as not anti-Chinese in this environment. So there's a kind of a relations between the build form and the social environment in the colonial era. This is the focus of his work. And for those who read his work, we would know that what is missing in his book is actually history of ethnic Chinese, the relationship between ethnic Chinese and technology, and the formation of nationalism. but he's aware of that, and therefore he has this little footnote, indicating that maybe one could actually think about the shop house in relations to the sense of safetyness, sense of the social environment structured by the power relations related to colonialism. Yeah. And of course this came out in 2008, but I have been thinking about this issue, so to me this is a kind of empowerment, for me to come up with this thesis that there's something to do, with the way in which the built environment register identity. Yeah. And of course I then begins to look at other media as well. Yeah. And I have started to collect volumes of Property Indonesia. This is actually a journal, a magazine used by property developers to self-promote themselves. When they have a new product, they would advertise this. But this is quite a good source for people who are interested in the ways in which, say, major cities in Indonesia, have been transformed by property developers. Yeah. And it is also very interesting to see the appearance or the regular occurrence of shop houses, the ruko. Yeah, ruko, rumah toko is a shorthand for shop houses. I haven't done the work where I should, right? Which is just at the time when the economy is booming, Property Indonesia would have all these special issues on ruko. Ruko, wow, buy ruko, and you would gain profit. It's a major thing for investment. And then at the time when there's an economic crisis, there's always this special issue on ruko as well. So ruko become a sort of like a signification for economic boom as well as economic decline. Yeah. Now the most interesting, of course, a sort of a period where ruko become a sort of a divestment. People started to stop buying ruko was really after the 98 riot. Yeah, at that time, ruko was basically people were abandoning ruko because of the whole associations of ruko and riot. But what is interesting is that about 5 years after 98, Property Indonesia begins to promote ruko again, like with this feeling that only ruko will be able to revive Indonesian economy. Yeah. So that would be one exercise that I should have done, right? Ruko, these are actually ruko, the prima donna of the property market. These are all major highlight, the title that came out from Property Indonesia. And the image here on this one here is actually more contemporary. This is from Ciputra's, group to continue to advertise ruko. Yeah, so ruko become a sort of a major commodity, major component for the property industries. And the way I research this is to just look at different social groups and their commentary over the notion of ruko, shop houses. So you have this planner's perspective. Yeah. Now this is actually not just planners, this is actually researcher as well. Obviously someone with a background in planning. I quote, today the ruko has achieved epidemic proportions in major cities of Indonesia. It wouldn't be an issue if the spread of the ruko was confined to a particular territory. Yeah, but trouble begins when many unplanned ruko spread uncontrollably to different areas. This has caused all kinds of problems: traffic jams, decline of public safety, increasing garbage, and the degradation of the visual environment. This is really from the planner's perspective. Yeah, it would be fine if you can put ruko all in one place. This is the zoning, for ruko. But the fact is that ruko has never been. Ruko always spread out. Yeah, it's always expanding. Yeah, to all kinds of different places. So that annoyed planners. So there's already this perception of ruko is uncontrollable. Yeah, it is not something that we want to see spreading. You have to control. So there's already these associations of uncontrollable beer forms circulating in Jakarta. And you can continue to move on. Now, this is Ruko Hockey. This is from Ikawan, a developer in Palembang. So I do this research not just by looking at Jakarta, but starting to look at other cities as well. Now Mr. Ikawan is a developer in Palembang would say, well, the economic players are largely Chinese. Now we use Orang Tionghoa, which is very interesting. Who believe that if they have 4 children, they must buy 4 ruko, right? And that is why I feel sure that if I build a ruko, there's always a buyer. So there's a whole feeling of regeneration. You can inherit ruko, and in fact, this ruko here happened to be 4 developed by Ikawan, and he called it ruko hockey. Hockey in Fukkianese, what do you call that? Like it's a fortunate. It's a good luck. So ruko in some way is associated with hockey. And this is again Yongki, another architect. In Jakarta, working in Riau, who is also in some way, this is an architect specializing in ruko. Now he has his own commentary. Now this is his whole idea about what ruko and the association with, with particular social group, right? These people are simple-minded. I mean, this is really quite an incredible statement. Who don't care about architectural and aesthetic considerations. They dislike trees around their ruko, right, and prefer to wall themselves off from the surrounding by adding extra story away from the street, right? And they also prefer small windows, and yet they favor eye-catching colors to draw attention. In short, they think only economically of how to generate capital from the ruko. This is an architect's view, who is also annoyed by the fact that there are many ruko coming up, and a lot of them are not really well designed, not really well thought out. And I'm just trying to find quite an interesting quotation from Mr. Yongki, who actually also make a claim that some of these shop houses, they are so high up to the sky, and the purpose of which is to develop I can't remember the quotation now. It is about nest, creating, what do you call that? In Hokkien is yen jiao. It's a particular bird, right, whose saliva can be turned into a very, what is it called? Burung walet. That's right. Burung walet. Can't remember the citation. What is burung walet in Sarang Burung? Anyway, all these birds' nests would be on the top floor, right, and they would attract, the burung walet, right, to produce a very expensive and supposedly, very nutritious sort of is it some kind of medicine? Medicine. They can turn into medicine. So this is anyway just some illustrations about the way in which people think about ruko. Now, so these are commentaries which you could actually easily get from social media as well. Now, this commentary is very easy to see. This is a commentary from non-ethnic Chinese looking at ruko. Ikawan and the Yongki, these are ethnic Chinese architects and planners who think about ruko. They would use the notion of Orang Tionghoa, and this one is Orang Cina. This is from the other side. Who would look, if you look at the buildings along the streets of Indonesian cities, you will see a row of ruko. All kinds of businesses can be conducted by the owners who live there. They're doing all kinds of different things. And what is particularly interesting for us is that the majority of the people who use or own ruko are ethnic Chinese. And it appears that for Chinese people who are starting their own business, they will do everything to buy a ruko. But for what, right? The ruko is not only a place for living and doing business, but it is also for investment. How smart they are. So this is a kind of it's a fascination over the ethnic Chinese business strategy, and in a very strange way, ruko got to be associated with the business strategy. So there's a sense of othering Ruko, but at the same time admiring Ruko as well as the embodiment of the success in business. So that is the kind of starting point where I start to realize that there's something to be done on this. Yeah, how particular build form got a sort of an association, yeah, related to ethnic Chinese, and also related to the idea of business. Okay, so you have the business, you have the Ruko, and then you have Orang Tionghoa, right? Now, this is very difficult to prove. You don't have the sort of clear evidence how they are related, but through all these scattered commentary stories, you begin to realize that this has a story, but at the same time, it may have a huge implication, yeah, when things happen in the city. Okay, so therefore I somehow title this chapter as kind of a Chinese layer, meaning it's like the way in which, right, Ruko is being infested with the meaning of Chineseness almost. And now let me move on, skipping some part on the colonial era, by looking at what we would call the layering the facade of Ruko. Now this is a kind of interesting because buildings has history. Yeah, if you look at the old Ruko in the old town of Jakarta, and then you could also look at the sort of like Ruko from the 70s, from the 80s, and then also eventually from the post-Suharto era. So there's a time component, right? And each period seems to express different form of Ruko. Yeah, and my kind of a little speculation or hypothesis is that during the Suharto era, and there's a lot of Ruko that was designed for mounting advertisement billboard. Yeah, and this is continuing. We cannot prioritize things in a very rigid manner. There's always this continuity. Yeah, but 70s, 80s were the time when, billboards. Yeah, Ruko is designed in a way that it shouldn't have any facade. It's supposed to be layered, yeah, layered by commodities, layered by all kind of billboards, and in a way, this can only be understood within the whole cultural politics of the state. The whole idea that a lot of our colleagues and friends have been studying about the erasure, so-called the erasure of Chinese identities in the public space. It's supposed to have no Chinese language. The architecture has to be in some way modernist, right? Beyond any identity association. And in a very strange way, billboards become a sort of a way in which you could lay it yourself. Yeah. So I use this fancy kind of a term, self-concealment. But by concealing yourself in this manner, you are also revealing yourself as a sort of an economy, being someone who is controlling commodity and controlling business network. You are dealers, of certain commodities. So that is the whole ironic sort of a situation. On the one hand, you conceal your Chinese identity, but at the same time, you are revealing yourself in a particular way. Yeah. So that is where the associations of Ruko and business continues. Right? And the associations of Ruko and ethnic Chinese also continues. And this seems to be a sort of a paradigm that has been used for designing Ruko during Suharto era. And I was inspired by some of the architectural students who were in the post-Suharto era. When they were asked to design Ruko, they were the one who inspired me. I have to acknowledge that. They use all these fancy words about layering facade, So I got inspired by them. And in fact, even right now, today, you go to, say, Gajah Mada Street, central part of Jakarta, close to the Batavia area, you still can see traces of 70s, 80s Ruko, and they were really just quite flat. Yeah, the whole facade is designed to be, to mount billboards. And then the other component, what is also important, if you see the slides the image down here. Unfortunately, I don't have a good image here. Yeah. Shop house Ruko has what they call the 5 feet alleyway. Kaki lima is the Indonesian term. Kaki lima is 5 feet. Yeah, 5 feet is a space where people can move around. It's a space for circulation, for traffic. But it is also at the same time, it's a space that is filled with ambiguity. Yeah, no one knows who actually owned that kaki lima. And therefore, it becomes a place where a lot of kaki lima, which in Indonesian is actually vendors. Kaki lima feel like they can actually occupy that space as well. Yeah. So kaki lima become a space where the shop owners, right, and the vendors somehow relate to each other. Yeah. Quite often, the shop owners would allow kaki lima to use the kaki lima. Yeah. And at the same time, the kaki lima people would also take care of that kaki lima as well. So there's a kind of an interesting mutual relations. But at the same time, it can also be a sort of what one might call annoying aspect, especially from planners' perspective, from the city, perspective, because it creates all kind of a jam. The kaki lima cannot be a space for circulation because it's always jammed with all kind of different things. Yeah. Now that is interesting and important because it has a lot to do with the way in which Ruko, right, ought to be understood. Yeah. Now I can only tell this story partly because I realized that when we move on to the post-Suharto era, this kaki lima more or less disappear. Yeah. Or it is no longer a major component in the design of Ruko, which is really quite interesting. And that actually happened after 98, after the whole riots thing, yeah, which is, to me, is quite unfortunate. But I will show you some images here. Right, the new layer in the post-Suharto era. That is actually after 2000, 2002, 2003. You look at, Majalah property, and even just go around different parts of Jakarta, you really get a sort of a new type of Ruko. Now, what makes this Ruko new first, is that it's just from this citation, right? The multifunctional concept, in some way has been changed. It is still there, Ruko is Ruko, Rumah and Toko, but the Ruko today, it doesn't really have this residential component anymore. In fact, it more looks like an office. It's more like an empty space. It becomes more monofunctional. It is really now for business. So therefore, right, you eventually they can categorize Ruko really as a sort of just a commercial property. It doesn't have that component of home anymore. So the house, the rumah, seems to somehow disappear. You only have the toko, and that is the one, I think, new aspect of the design. But in a very strange way, this has a huge consequence on the way Ruko is being understood. Ruko start to be dissociated from the owners. In some way, it displays the notion of Chineseness here. It's because anyone, in fact, can buy Ruko and open Ruko and make business in Ruko because it is no longer associated with the old idea of Ruko. And then another important component is that a lot of design of Ruko really eliminate that kaki lima, that space of negotiation. They are now really for automobile parking space, and when you have this kind of parking space in major cities, you always have people who organize that parking, tukang parkir, they would actually, they are also guard as well. They are actually trying to prevent vendors to come into the site. So there is a kind of a retreat in some way from what you might call the vendors, the street, with the eliminations of the kaki lima, being now replaced by parking lot. So and then when it comes to the building function, if you look at the floor plan, you realize that the whole design is really not meant for a house. There's no kitchen anymore. There's a little pantry. But it's all for, you can rent the space Yeah, and the design is also interesting. Yeah, it become more stylistic, put it that way. Yeah, you have the Mediterranean concept, you have the minimalist, you have all sorts of things. And apparently it is also the attempt to organize billboards. Yeah, so billboards can really be placed at certain areas. So there's a kind of a sense of trying to create a new image, yeah, to allow Ruko to be a major investment for owners, yeah, for people for buyers as well. And so my kind of a speculation is that this kind of a change has to be in some way related, right, to the whole issues of changes of perceptions of ethnic Chinese or ethnic Chinese strategy, to think about themselves by way of the changing design of the Ruko itself. It is purely speculative, but I think we have to find a language, yeah, to talk about these relations. So this is a kind of a new layer of post-Suharto, yeah. And what is interesting is that I begin to pick up some of these new commentaries, the sort of commentaries for the new type of Ruko, yeah. And this is just one quotation from someone who begins to realize that Ruko is no longer so much associated with ethnic Chinese, but it is a sort of a building that operate on the basis of concealing what is within, It's now this is, some people say you are stretching a little bit too much, Yeah, but so you can see some Ruko, right? Wow, this Ruko, there's a Terselubung, there's a hidden place. You don't know, well, Ruko, they all look alike, right? There's no storefront, there's maybe up there, people do gambling, right? There are all kind of suspicious things going on, maybe, sex workers are inside, and there's also this idea that, well, some people use it for church and so on and so forth. In other words, there's a difficulty in understanding what is behind Ruko. And there's a sense of worry as well, what is going on. Right? So, and that kind of a commentary seems to only appear at the time when you have this new Ruko, the post-Suharto era. Yeah? In the past, it is quite easy to associate Ruko with ethnic Chinese, but today it's far more difficult. Yeah? So it's a kind of an interesting development, yeah? As an attempt to now trying to control Ruko, at the same time feeling like Ruko cannot be easily controlled. So, the last part of this chapter is actually looking at the emergence of new type of Ruko, which is what they call Islamic Ruko, yeah? Which is fascinating, and this is actually located not in Jakarta, but in Depok. For those who know the geography of Jakarta and Depok, this was built in, I think, 2012, quite recent. At the time when Depok was, and maybe until today, is still controlled by the PKS. This is an Islamic party, yeah, who really somehow tried to make Depok more Islamic. Yeah, and what is interesting, as far as we are concerned, is the emergence of Islamic Ruko, yeah, with all kind of practices that one could basically say, well, this is just a Ruko that we have seen elsewhere. But of course, they only sell halal food and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of the way in which Ruko now it carries a meaning that is no longer associated with ethnic Chinese. Yeah, it now circulates, to different social groups as well. And if you just look at the form, it's a kind of an interesting. Yeah, it doesn't use any what you might call vernacular mosque. Right? But Hugh would tell us this is actually the dome associated more to the Middle Eastern architecture rather than the vernacular roof type of Indonesian mosque. But this need to be analyzed contextually, right? Therefore, yeah, the whole Islamic party, the way they think about Islam and so on and so forth, to be able to understand the development of this Islamic movement. So that, in some way, is the first part of my talk. I hope I'm not taking too long time, Gemma. So that is this is just a kind of a snapshot of looking at how I approach Ruko. Yeah, sort of how it entangled with the social order, like how it somehow tried to disentangle, from social order, and how Ruko now seems to be able to move beyond the association with ethnic Chinese. Okay, sorry. So the second part, I'm going to be very brief here, just to show you the table of content of this forthcoming book. I'm still having some trouble with it. So you can see the visual environment. The second chapter is about the shophouse. Trying to see how the shophouse, in some way, tells us a lot about issues of ethnic Chinese, the context of the riot, and then how to overcome that period. One could think about maybe there's an issue of how to move beyond conflict, issues of trauma, and so on and so forth. So I put them together under the visual environment. And then there's a whole section on all kind of different, popular culture stuff. The comics, the telsil is cerita silat, the martial art stories, the film, family albums, and then about developers and architects, and then a little bit about the way people think about Chinese house. So I'm going to go through very quickly, one by one, just one slide per chapter. The first one is about the riots. This is a kind of an old piece. I think, can't remember, published maybe in 2002 or 2003. So already 15 years old, but still allow me to think about the whole context of the development of the new visual environment. So this is about 98, the aftermath of the May riots, and the way in which the city tried to forget. So it talks about issues of remembering and forgetting, and how the absence of, say, memorial in the aftermath of riot actually generate remembering at a very local level, through oral history, and the appearance of this oral history or stories about May riot. It came through words rather than through any monuments, and that to me is far more powerful. But at the same time, you feel like maybe there needs to be a memorial. But there's also a feeling that if you have a memorial, people tend to forget because they thought the memorial will carry the burden of remembering. But it is precisely because there's no memorial, people talk in a way that is quite haunting because it's so discursive. So that's why I look at some popular representations of the May riot by Indonesian novelists, Seno Bumira Ajidharma, who look at Indonesian society 40 years after the event. So it's a wonderful short story called Jakarta 2023 or something. It's about the future, looking back at a city where there's no memory. So that is really, to me, it's kind of an opening things, but also these riots create a whole moment of the awareness of Chinese identity. Some people who have actually gone to one part of Jakarta in Chandranaya, near Glodok, Chinatown area, would be able to see that little structure. It belongs to Ko Kim An, the last, Kapitan of Batavia, and the whole contestation over where should this house be located. So all this awareness of Chinese identity, ethnic identity came, after the Suharto era. And the picture on our left bottom is about reminding of the horror of Glodok being burned down, and the building of the new structure that really have no traces of that violence at all. So the whole theme is about remembering and forgetting. And we have seen the shophouse, right? And then I look at how shophouse begins to have its own narrative. Well, shophouse can't tell any story. I can tell the story in a sort of a interpretative way. And then the third chapter is about comics, right? About cerita silat. Cerita silat is this one. Ko Ping Ho. There's a interesting because I grew up with this book. The whole series. Where you spend your holidays not going anywhere but just consume this cerita silat, the martial art story. And in some way, I start to wonder, why I'm attracted to this. It's never clear to me, but if you read this kind of stories, it tells tells you a lot about China. Yeah, Chinese stories, but at the same time, it's a Chinese stories that blend with Japanese mythology as well. So there's a syncretic component. You know, you have all the Chinese hero, right? 师父, 师兄, 师妹, you know, all these terms, and then it mixed with Indonesian Sinta, Sita, Dewi, and all kind of different things. So it's interesting, and that also came during Suharto era, at the time when you just simply have no access to Chinese history. Yeah. Well, you get to know a lot of Chinese film, but certainly not from mainland China, but from Hong Kong, for example. So that is a different kind of Chinese culture. And then this cartoon is interesting because Pak Tung Tung, this is a sort of a, what do you call that? When in the newspaper, you always have this little comic, you know, strip at the bottom. Zerpan, yeah, but with gamba, with drawing. And Pak Tung Tung is from Medan. Yeah, Medan is a place where I was born. I grew up there, and the illustrator is actually my own uncle. Yeah, so I saw him doing all this drawing thing, you know, and I find it interesting because his work is very different from Ko Put On from the 1930s. Ko Put On has a lot of text. Yeah, he talks a lot. It's very talkative, you know, with all kind of different terms. But the Pak Tung Tung's era, there's no words at all. Yeah. Now again, I am stretching a little bit too much by looking at my own uncle, you know, what kind of Chinese and the whole politics of language and so on and so forth. There's an interesting story which we can discuss a little bit more. Yeah, the Pak Tung Tung character and the Ko Put On 1930s, right? Pak Tung Tung, you know, he continued to draw until late 80s. Yeah, then he moved on, and because Pak Tung Tung copyright is actually with Annalisa. Annalisa is the newspaper's name, and they hire someone to learn his style, my uncle's own style, you know. So Pak Tung Tung continued to run today, but it's no longer my uncle. Yeah, and my uncle cannot claim any right at all. It belongs to the newspaper. So it's a lot of conflict in here. It's not so happy and ending. And the film this is another visual culture that, you know, I thought this is interesting, and I got invited to talk about film, and in a sort of way, amateur way, I tried to interpret the way Su Hockey, everyone knows here, and how the idea of youth, yeah, and I look at how Riri Rija, this really interesting and progressive filmmaker, represent ethnic Chinese. And so there's a lot of interesting depiction of ethnic Chinese identity. Yeah. I can't remember what my argument was now. Relation with communism, relation with, you know, being youthful, how to be Indonesian. I think there's kind of an attempt to think about, you know, how ethnic Chinese could be a good ethnic Chinese by way of participating in politics in a way that one could think about Su Hockey. Yeah. So there's a kind of interesting repositioning of Chinese beyond what we call economy being, beyond the Ruko. Yeah. Now it becomes a political subject, but yet it is a political subject that has to be accepted by the nation. Yeah, particular type of hero, which I thought is really quite interesting. Maybe subconscious, but that is again a kind of a speculation that we put forward, you know, to Riri Rija. Now the fifth chapter is about family album, yeah, of a very wealthy Chinese family in Dutch colonial era. So this actually go back to history from 1930s. Yeah, there's a rich family, elite Chinese family. They are what they call the Kui family, KWEE. And these families now live in Netherlands, yeah? And the family, the album is now, you know, they basically give the whole set of album to Netherlands Institute for War Documentation, and they even set up a project, yeah, about ethnic Chinese in Indonesia during colonial era. And one of the good friends of mine, Peter Cruz, who holds the copyright, yeah, he invited me to, you know, Abidin, come over to my house, I'll show you all these albums. can we set up a research project on visual culture, just by looking at this album? I said, yes, but I had never had this intention of actually publishing something about this, but he encouraged me to do so. He said, I will do the interview, I will give you the context, you just write something. So that's what I did. and so it's a kind of to me, and maybe this is the good thing about not knowing them, then you feel in some way have that feeling of freedom a little bit, stretching a little bit to interpret the family album, and in a way that I then allow Peter Post to read it and see if that looks okay. Yeah, and so far it's okay, but you never be quite sure. But my argument, I think I have an argument in this chapter, which is to show family album, as a representation of crisis of ethnic Chinese business in the colonial era. Yeah, so because the whole album was composed after the decline of their sugar plantation, so the story is not really about the image, but how each photo is organized. So the relationship between one photo to the next photo, the album itself is the story, not the object, not the particular image. How they put in one page, the death of the elder uncle and the birth of a new baby together. So there's a sense of continuity. So I just make all this interpretation. Not so much about the truth of the particular object, but how one piece is related to another piece. So the story is actually about the album, how they make connection between photographs. So there, is the fifth, and the sixth is about ethnic Chinese developers. There's a long story, and there's a whole controversy over the ownership of land, right, in major cities in Indonesia. And this has a kind of an interesting story because I combine it with architects. And this came out of an invitation of Pak Leo Suryadinata in Singapore, who is actually working on a multi-volume, in some way commissioned by Eddie Lembong, about the role of ethnic Chinese in Indonesian history, but based on professions. So I was contacted by Pak Leo, Abidin, why don't you do something on architects? And that is actually quite interesting as well. So I have to come up with the format has been described in a way that you should do mostly who is who kind of format, So you have to name and then who they are. It's a great adventure when it comes to architect, because I realize that there are many wonderful ethnic Chinese architects who are not comfortable to be identified as ethnic Chinese. They prefer to be, just architect. So for that, I couldn't include them, right? Because there's a whole format that they have to acknowledge who they are first. So there's a whole interesting, inclusion and exclusion, and then you can theorize that in a very interesting way as well. And I say architects okay, and in some way, I'm looking not just architects as builder, but architects as historian, architects as civil servant, architects as conservationists, architects who work in kampong, in order to diversify the profile of architects, that they are not just simply designing for the rich, but they actually, they did a lot of work in a sort of a more social manner. So to diversify the image of architects. And I then also, asked maybe previous, right, the developers, and the reason has been that I thought that I have in some way depict the architects in a very positive manner, and I thought I should set up a balance. If they are good Chinese, there should be bad Chinese as well. So that is where the developers chapters come in. I say, wow, Pak Leo, can I do the developers part? Wow, I picture the developers in a way that is really, wow, these are just businessmen transforming space and so on and so forth. So to keep that kind of a balance, so you have two kinds of ethnic Chinese. And of course, I got a lot of criticism from the developer side. I do not know whether they can actually publish it. It would be interesting to see. in the end, I just couldn't revise it. You get commentary, well, can you say something good about developers, right? And in the end, we agree, okay, so why don't we end with a conclusion by looking at how they use their corporate social responsibility, I said, okay, so I wrote 2 pages on that to show, how they clean their soul, right? All kind of different things. So it's kind of fun, but at the same time, I was quite worried as well, what is this going to be? So these are, some of the thing, and then the last part is basically reviewing 2 major books by a historian of material culture of ethnic Chinese houses in Southeast Asia. And what I'm trying to show is the kind of a museumization of what you might call the idea of Chinese identity, through this kind of what you call iconic houses, really amazing, beautiful sort of depiction, but nothing is said about what we call the modernist Chinese. If you look at a lot of Chinese today, they are actually more into the modern design rather than this old-fashioned one. So I'm trying to problematize some of the representations of Chinese houses. So I think this would be, the whole set. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Abidin. There's so much material there, and I've had the privilege of having had a look at that manuscript with all those chapters in more detail. It's fabulous stuff, and we could talk at length for each of these topics that you've raised. But I guess just to kind of summarise your approach here, which is to tell us more about the history of the ethnic Chinese, their identities then and now through through reading different sources or from the textual, which is exactly what you're doing, which is in the built environment, in film and these other spaces, places. And in the chapter headings that you have, there are subheadings that give us too a really good insight into how you're seeing this, which is very much the private public face. Yeah, very much about the what is hidden almost, or what is protected and domesticated and not really visible, perhaps, or has not been made visible to those of us who are outside to understand and see, such as the family albums. Who was that intended for? Is it for the next generation? That kind of thing. About the homes that Chinese live in. So on the one hand, there's that unseen kind of domestic sphere, and then you're showing us this projection of the Chinese and how they are projecting themselves and how people are interpreting it, which is, as the shop house is kind of the exemplary example, which, the commercial face that Indonesians have for so long seen. What I want to kind of ask a question about is, you open the book with the riots, and I just wonder if, do you see May 98 as a bit of ground zero for ethnic Chinese, talking maybe today, for the generations today who are trying to understand their identity within Indonesian nationalism? And I guess I would include you in that when I ask you to maybe reflect personally on on writing this book, and how you've approached it.
Thank you. I think this is a very good question, because it allows us to reflect on our own subjectivity. And then when we say May riots, which took place in '98, I think what is important is a terrible event. But what is really important is that it allows us to think about the Suharto era. I think is what is interesting. You suddenly realize that you have to understand that era. And I was born in 1966. So that was the year when Suharto came into power. So I belong to the generation that grew up in what we call national amnesia. And the reason now I realize why I went to architectural school, because that is a kind of a safe profession. Right? You would be a good professional, right? Away from politics. And in some way, you really had no idea about politics. You don't even know that you were actually leading to that professionalization of the Suharto generation. And so the 98 and the aftermath of it really opens up not so much the new door, but it allows a new look to your own self. And I finished my PhD in late 1997, and I submitted my dissertation in 98. Before graduation, that would be around April, before the riot. My parents came to the US for the first time, just for that graduation, and they couldn't return because sisters, brothers in Jakarta said, don't let this couple to come back, stay there, so they hang on for until October or something. And so I didn't witness that until later on I went back, and you only saw traces, all those violence. But the real impact is not just the built environment. It was quite astounding. You could see, even until today, there are all these gates, which actually set up for the 98, continue until today. All the different gated communities and so on and so forth. But I think the real impact is the time when people start to talk about Suharto in a different way. There's the post-Suharto era, and that opened up sort of a different way to think about your own self, how you were constructed during Suharto era, what you knew about history and all those things. And of course, I was one of the sort of a privileged one who, got scholarship to study in the US, where you have more access to sources and so on and so forth. But it just made you understand better, your own era. And in some way, the whole post-Suharto era is all about rethinking Indonesia in a different way. So I begin to be fascinated by that project as well. How can you think about ethnic Chinese in relation to the idea of becoming Indonesian in the new era? So I think this writing has probably a struggle over that whole issues. Not sure if I have come to terms with it, but I think that process allowed me to at least talk a little bit about, something about myself maybe.
The others have questions?